Welcome to today's webinar on ADB's Green Roads learning events with particular focus on barriers to women's public transport use today. And this is one of the webinars, while the next one will take place on June 10th, and that will focus on climate change and road safety together jointly with Asia Pacific Road Safety Organization. So we look forward to see you there as well. But for now, we focus on women's public transport use. I would introduce myself. My name is Ketevan, and I'm ADB gender specialist with focus on integrating gender equality aspects across projects and programs in ADB with background also focusing on transport sector in South Asia, East Asia, Central and West Asia, and private and public sector projects. Without further ado, let's move to the topic of our webinar today. We know that women are underrepresented in the transport sector, both as employees, but also as users of the transport. And while they are a large majority of the transport users, we have to ensure that their needs are addressed, what is very often overlooked and not sufficiently addressed. But in the first matter, we need to understand what are the needs and what are the issues to be considered. And that's what our webinar will explore today. Our speaker today is Dr. Subeh Chowdhury, and she is an internationally recognized expert in the transport sector with focus on inclusive design. And she currently serves at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. And she brings wealth of experience, not only from academia, but from the industry itself. And her research and studies have focused on inclusive design, behavioral patterns, and using public transport, policy advice, and many, many others. And she is very seasoned expert and brings wealth of practical as well of academic experience, and what will, I'm sure, enrich our discussion even more today. Without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Subeh, but let me remind you that today's session will initially cover a presentation followed by question and answer sessions, and we very much look forward to your active participation. Therefore, we kindly ask you to put your questions in the chat box and we will address them in today's session. Thank you very much, and over to you, Subeh. Thank you.
Thank you, Kita, for the introduction. Okay, I'm going to try and share my screen. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Can you see my screen, Kita?
Yes, all good, thank you.
Okay, good, thanks. Okay, thank you everyone for taking the time to join us in this discussion. Today I will be exploring barriers that women encounter, really emphasizing on the importance of basically why should we care and what can we do for practical improvements. And this is really directed towards policymakers and practitioners. So the why. So let's start with the why. So why is it important? Globally, women are higher riders of public transport, and this is true in developed as well as developing countries. There are many factors that influence women's ridership of public transport. The gender pay gap plays a part, where many women on average earn a lot less than in comparison to men. Women's complexity of their travel patterns, their needs. A lot of women are caregivers of elderly and young children. And so there's a high dependency on being able to use an affordable system that takes them to the destinations that they require. And this is even more important in developing countries where we see that women are very much reliant on informal public transport systems. So this is also known as paratransit. So this is your tuk-tuk, your rickshaws, and this dependency that they have on paratransit can be an advantage as well as a disadvantage for their travel needs. So we'll discuss that too in a few slides. So with these two together, we think that, okay, women are higher users of public transport. Yet on the flip side, they are more likely to be harassed. And when I mean harassment, I mean verbal, nonverbal, as well as physical harassment. And this also varies depending on where you live in terms of context, in terms of cultural context as well. And then I will discuss a little bit more about the need for better gender data and how that can actually help us move towards a more inclusive system. So public transport is very much a gendered aspect. When we're thinking about access to public transport, we're not only thinking about time travel and efficiency, but actually who has access to it. And one of the core definitions of accessibility is the number of entry points to the system as well as affordability. So as a result, when we look at the different in the different user groups, we have to understand that there is a difference between women and men. And this study we did recently in Auckland, where we looked at men and women's access to public transport, to, in particular to transit-oriented developments, which are designed for accessibility. And we can see that a higher proportion of women end up using public transport, are able to walk to these public transport stations within that are within 1 kilometer radius of the station. As soon as we go outside 1 kilometer, we can see that a higher proportion of men end up using public transport. So this discrepancy in their travel needs shows that that transport access is very much gendered, and it's something that we need to be aware of when we're thinking and designing and implementing design guidelines as well as transport policies. So in developing country, the entire trip is a lot more complex because we're looking at how women are able to connect from different origins and destinations. And this means that they are having to travel, encountering perhaps poor built environment. They could be at a station that actually doesn't provide enough lighting, seating. We did this study over in Delhi with a PhD student of mine, and the idea was to see, well, how do women of different income groups actually connect to the public transport system? And we looked at low-income women, which are often marginalized, and there's very limited data in research as to their travel experiences. And what we found was that when they finally do arrive to the station, they have to then board a vehicle that doesn't actually stop. So the vehicle slows down at the station because they're in such the need for reducing travel time is so high that the drivers actually just slow down. So women in their cultural attire then virtually have to jump into the vehicle. And then once they're actually in the vehicle, then there may not be any seating. And then if it's a crowded vehicle, then you can very much have the expectation that there may be some physical harassment that could happen. And so this sort of scenario sort of gives us the understanding that while we are, as transportation engineers and planners, are moving towards this inclusive system, and we are very much focused on reducing travel time and cost, and looking towards climate adaptation, there are groups of the population that are extremely marginalized and don't have their needs met to the extent that we as transportation specialists would really like them to have. So while I've given you an overview of the issues, let's talk about what are the root causes of these barriers. Because unless we understand what the root causes of these barriers are, we will actually never be able to fully comprehend the extent of the issue. So one of the first issues of these root is action of these two factors. So patriarchal attitudes and cultural norms, these in many countries are for that country. So there's religious context that goes through about how societal norms are formed. And this is absolutely acceptable because different countries function in different ways. Patriarchal attitudes, when we have a lot of male dominancy in the transport sector, then what this does is that it actually pushes down the needs of women. And as a result, many women are treated as second class citizens, particularly those that are marginalized. And I spoke a little bit about harassment. When a harassment does occur, so an incident does occur, then it's very common for victim blaming to occur. So this actually reduces the number of incidents that are actually reported in the first place. So there was a study actually by the ADB. It was a report, and they said that 90% of women in Southeast Asia or South Asia country, they experience harassment, yet only 7%, less than 10% are actually reported. So this is actually attributed to victim blaming. When you have a patriarchal society and when you have a religious society where the norms and the societal ideas get twisted to the treating of being a second-class citizen and normalizing that harassment and consequences are not required, then this actually adds to the barriers for women. So there's the societal barrier that exists. So now let's talk about the drawbacks in the infrastructure. So I talked about the first and last mile connection. So there's the issue with built environment. There's also unregulated informal paratransit modes that exist as well in developing countries. And I talked about how accessibility is made out of two factors. One is being able to access the network in the first place, and the second one is affordability. So when we think about rapid transit, when we think about a integrated multimodal system, we're improving accessibility. But the question is, who are we improving that accessibility for? Because if the connection to these stations, to these different stops, are not actually affordable, are not actually accessible, then you're actually breaking that system, separating that system down for some user groups. The other issue that we have is security provisions. So security provisions are things like lighting, putting in CCTV, which in my opinion, is more of a passive forms can be of security measures. Because what we actually need to focus on is providing a community natural surveillance so that there is more surveillance of what is happening. So picture this scenario. You are coming home after work. You've had dinner and it is 8 p.m. and you're at a metro station that is underground. And you are protected from the authorities' point of view because you have good lighting. There is clear line of sight so you can see anyone from a mile away, and there's CCTV cameras so you feel protected. But do you actually feel protected in an empty station at 8 p.m.? Most women would say no because they are not there. There's no bystanders. There's nobody around to actually help them and intervene at that position if an incident was to occur. So I know that resources with staff can be limiting for many authorities, but then we need to start thinking about moving away from where natural surveillance is actually downplayed and seen as something that's difficult to do. Because what we need to actually understand is that we can provide a more communal way of protecting different users. Um, I've discussed a little bit about unregulated informal paratransit modes. So when I'm thinking about unregulated transit modes, I'm thinking about rickshaws and tuk-tuks. And these are both a advantage as well as a disadvantage to the economy. Because for women, they are very reliant on paratransit for their daily modes. So it's for their daily activities. Um, However, during certain times, say for example during peak time, again, regulate if it's unregulated, then drivers can actually charge twice, three times the amount that's normally charged for their service. And we've seen that at for different income groups, they actually choose different paratransit modes because it suits them. They're able to afford that extra level of security. Then I also discussed about underreporting of harassment. So this underreporting, the systematic way that we actually deal with an incident that occurs, can take it all the way to the consequences that could occur. This sometimes there is a break in the system. And if you are in a society that is heavily drawn upon patriarchal attitudes, then what happens is that in that system, somewhere the report doesn't actually get escalated. And so the victim had actually gone through the trouble of reporting an incident, despite knowing that there may victim blaming could occur, to then realizing that there's no consequences for what they've reported. So this discourages from incidents to be reported. And what it means for operators is that they are unable to know what type of incidents are occurring. Is it verbal? Is it intimidation? Is it physical? And without this knowledge, we are unable to actually tailor the way that we're providing the system. So when I'm talking about infrastructure, I'm talking about the station's design, the vehicle design, the waiting area. How are we actually designing it so that if an incident was to occur, that women actually do feel protected? Because one of the main critical elements of any woman's travel decision is personal safety. But personal safety is hardly ever considered in any benefit cost ratio analysis. It's hardly considered in a lot of decision making processes. And because it comes down to perception, and it's like, how do we actually measure perception? But then there are ways, and I would like to talk about them more in the next session, in the next part of this presentation. So as I mentioned earlier, when we talk about the first and last mile connection, this has an impact on a different user groups. So we found in this in Delhi, India, that people of higher income, women of higher income, were actually able to buy security. Now I want you to think about that for a minute. Those of higher income are actually able to buy their security. So they're able to reserve modes where they're the only passenger. But if you are not able to afford, and if you don't have the income level to support that, then you are either trapped in that area of where you are sharing a paratransit, and that's not as bad as being a low income woman standing in a station that doesn't have any infrastructure to support her needs. And so there was another study that I was involved in. We were looking at women who work in garments factory over in Bangladesh, and their commute to the slums of where their home was. And all of these women, they finished late at night. So they finish around 10 p.m., late into the night. And so they were discussing that they actually form a group and they travel in a group so that it's safety in numbers, so that they actually feel more protected to be with a group of women. But still, they are actually they still have to move through poor environments. They still have to walk a longer distance to actually access the public transport network. So again, I'm emphasizing, and I've already said this point, but I just want to emphasize that when, from an equity perspective, when we are designing public transport system, which is a public good and is almost a right of a citizen for any country, we need to figure out who exactly are we designing the system for. Because if we're going to design a system that's going to benefit the wealthy, then it is the user group that are most dependent on the system, that are often marginalized, that actually get the worst attributes of that system. So this brings me to my next point when we think about multimodal public transport systems. And multimodal public transport systems are getting a lot of attention. I remember when this started about a decade ago, when more and more cities were figuring out how do we actually create a multimodal system, because authorities have worked out that if we give a multimodal system, then we have all these advantages. So we've got more destination choices, we've got better reliability because we're providing better provisions for the public transport system. We are also reducing the wait time that people have to wait to get onto a vehicle, because that is one of the aspects of an therefore cost efficient for operators. And then because multimodal systems are becoming more global, there's funding available for developing countries. Now, I want you to think about how this actually applies to women. So for women, it actually does mean more transfers. What does more transfer mean? It means that more time outside the vehicle. So that means that they are more exposed to whichever journey position that they're in. So again, let's go back to my scenario of the woman who has finished dinner after work, 8 p.m. She has boarded her train. Now, the train service actually takes her to a transfer station before she then boards to the next leg. While she's at that station, she's now at that station at, say, 8:30, 9 p.m. Normally, she's at that station around 6 p.m. because she usually catches her train at 5 p.m. So immediately, she's exposed to an environment that she's not, typically accustomed to. So this exposure, because of more transfer time, that's something that as transportation specialists, we need to think about. How do we actually design systems so that women's needs are protected and their travel needs are also met at the same time? Women also have very complex journeys overall. This is global. So this is any mode that they choose, they end up having a more complex journey due to a higher proportion of household responsibility and caregiving. So when we are developing integrated public transport systems and we're saying that you now have to make more transfers, we are making their journeys a little bit more complex. So we're already adding another layer of complexity to this journey. How can we resolve it? Well, that's something that we need to think about. But I am here to just make you aware that these things are there. And I think acknowledgement of the issues is really the first step. So again, more transfer time means that more time either in a crowded or an isolated station. And there's a lot of research out there that talks about how women absolutely avoids isolated, desolated areas. Even if the walking path to that station, even if the station is crowded and has enough natural surveillance, if the walking path includes any sort of empty car parks or any sort of isolated point, if they know beforehand, they will try their best to avoid that walking path. And so this fear of being in an area where no one else is around is very strong for women, because it's that fear of victimization that takes hold of their travel decisions. Now, when we think about integrated system, it could also mean that there could be higher chances of missed connections. Again, what this means is they're exposed to the environment that they're in. So when we're thinking about transfers, usually we're thinking of an offset. So if, for example, you are at train A and you are leaving for train B and you have that offset, a lot of times operators are trying to minimize that transfer time because they want to minimize the time that people have to wait. This is what research has shown, that people don't like waiting time and they think that this is unproductive time, so we need to reduce it. But then if there are different levels of changing from one vehicle to another, then that means that there's a higher likelihood that you might actually miss a connection. What that means, it circles back to when we are providing more transfer, we're actually exposing women more to the urban environment. And this is again acknowledging that this is how we're playing out. This is the system that we're designing. And so how does this actually impact different user groups? Okay, so let's think about the how. Now that we've talked about the why, let's consider how do we actually step forward to resolving some of these issues. So one of the things that we've found, and this is again with my PhD student, we looked at Southeast Asian countries, and I myself in my own research have found that there is a very a deep lack of gender inclusive transport policies. Most transport policies, if lucky, or lucky in the sense that if someone, a gender specialist, has been able to gone through and advocated, then women could be included. But we have seen examples where women are included in the vulnerable population group. Vulnerable population group includes people with disability, children, elderly. Women don't have the same transport needs as people with disability, unless, of course, there's an intersection between the two. So globally, I've seen that there is a very strong need for gender inclusive transport systems. And one of the main reasons, as I mentioned earlier, is that personal safety is simply just not a priority when we start to think about dollar value and what we're actually going to put in. There's also a disconnect between international guidelines, so guidelines that are provided by Asian Development Bank, World Bank, United Nations. They have rolled out gender toolkits to assist national practitioners to adhere to the sustainability goals. Yet, when we interviewed policymakers, leaders in the field, they said, yes, we acknowledge that these guidelines. However, when it comes to implementation, we think about, do we really need to do it? I mean, is there something else that we can do? And this sort of thinking of wondering, is gender important, is why I discussed the presentation of the first, that providing that transport access to transport system is very much gendered. And these toolkits provide a valuable tool to understand how do we actually translate different national policies so that they can actually be implemented by practitioners. So in this study, we've actually developed a framework to assist practitioners and policymakers to be more gender inclusive. And in that study, we have this diagram where we have looked at national policies, of course, those that are publicly available and in English. And we found that overall, from the 12 countries that we looked at, 30% of the countries in Southeast Asia and South Asia actually include some form of gender. The National Transport Policy in Pakistan actually recognizes women's limited mobility needs. They include guidelines. They include all of the addressed women's travel needs, and they recognize that maybe there is something that we need to do, but never actually filters down to actionable items in the framework. So one of the main issues that is difficult to actually create that gender inclusive policy and all the way to implementation is the lack of data. We don't have very good data that can be disaggregated and can be looked at from an intersectional lens. So what do I mean by intersectional lens? I mean, when we look at women, we often look at women in a homogeneous group. So, but then there are different intersections, different user groups within the subgroup of women, right? So we've got women with disability, we've got women of low income, women who are often marginalized with low literacy, for example. And so when we have a restriction in the data, the disaggregated data that there are, then it's very difficult to provide evidence. And often evidence is what leads to any sort of reform in the system. And we have to realize that dependent public transport users are the ones who are the higher user of public transport. And if we don't provide them, the marginalized population group, with a public transport system, then we're actually not achieving the goal of a public transport system. So I'd like to conclude by saying that at first we need to acknowledge that this is an issue. The second thing I'd like for you to consider is, how long do we ask women to continue taking precautionary measures? And I chose this diagram, this picture here, because I feel like although this is a model picture and it's staged, it actually represents how women act in a vehicle. So here we have her looking at her phone, using headphones, and this is virtually using technology to separate herself from people around. She's also not sitting with other passengers and choosing to stand, even though it may be more uncomfortable. But at least now she's been able to physically separate herself from the public. And many times with precautionary measures, women downplay how they dress. They refuse to wear jewelry, makeup, because they don't want to attract the attention to themselves. So how long do we actually ask women to take on precautionary measures in their daily lives? And when will it be the right time to finally realize that personal safety does matter and it needs to be prioritized when we are making transport decisions? My favorite idea of how to think about this is actually from a study by Vera Gray and Kelly, and they talk about the right amount of panic. And they argue that there's actually no right amount of panic. Either you have too little panic, where something awful could happen, so an incident is more likely to happen if you have too little panic, or you could be overly panicked and you could, acutely plan and decide every minute of your daily trip and every angle of it, and then you are reducing the likelihood of something happening. So there's no real right amount of panic. There's only too much panic if you want to stay safe in your daily commute. And this is something that I would like practitioners and policymakers to really think, because this is how it is to be a woman. It is normalizing that to be a woman and to use public transport, that you may experience harassment, and it is a normal way of, and in some countries it is normalized. And this is where I'm saying that no, we can actually do better. As transport specialists, we can actually advocate for women to have equal rights to using a transport system that is designed for the public after all. I thank you for your time, and I will stop sharing my screen, and I'm open to questions at the moment.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the presentation. And I think those examples, hearing those examples, along with the data and evidence, was quite insightful. Dear participants, feel free to post the question. But meanwhile, maybe I start with some general questions. So I think you mentioned a number of aspects when you started sharing on why it's important and how gender equality and women's aspect is related to the use of transport. But what, in your opinion, what is some of the biggest, largest issue that needs to be considered, particularly by development practitioners? Is it policy? Is it data? Or, in your opinion, or we need more integrated approaches? Or what would be your view? Because this is a very large topic. A lot of these factors are interlinked, we understand. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that is an excellent question to start. I think that it is really a systematic change. I think international agencies, organizations like Asian Development Bank have done quite a lot to improve women's situation in the transport sector. And I think that now it's really making sure that those guidelines are actually adhered to in the first place. So I think it's more of a systematic, because as I mentioned, when we are in some countries where there are patriarchal attitudes, where there are religious contexts, then some of these guidelines may be difficult to be incorporated. And I think that we have to be context sensitive and figure out a way that we have to figure out one, not let religious context or cultural context be the root factor for women being treated as second-class citizens and normalizing that harassment and victim blaming is actually okay in society. I think that really is the first step to improving the system.
Thank you very much. There's one question that I appreciate your presentation, and there's a question. You mentioned different transport needs of women, and have you observed any special distribution of these varying needs, for instance, depending on the geography, location, and etc., how this can vary some of these challenges?
So, sorry, say again. Is it varies across globally or?
Observed any special distribution of these varying needs in
Oh,
your
right.
study?
Okay. Yes. Um, so in developed countries, of course, again, when it comes to context, if you look at developed countries that are car centric, then you see that a lot of these issues are related to are more infrastructure. So they're more related to, for example, that last and first and last mile connection, or the provisions or the infrastructures that are in place in stations and the connecting routes. In developing countries, I can only speak for Southeast Asia because that's where we did our study on. But I have read other studies that are in African cities, and the issue there is really the patriarchal attitude. So getting to it, that acknowledgement that transport is gendered, I think that is the first thing. And I was speaking to someone else before the webinar started, and they mentioned, how about like pink buses or women only transport? Do they actually resolve any of these issues? And my opinion on that is that this is just you're just a simple you're just only figuring out what are the symptoms of the issues. You're not really getting to the root cause of it. So you're only just providing a solution, again, making women feel like they need special attention and they need special transport systems in order to actually be safe. But what if you're in a country that doesn't actually is unable to afford these special systems? Then I think that root cause has to be resolved.
Thank you very much. There is one question about you mentioned gender policies or transport policies that are gender inclusive. However, we see that even though, and there is an example from South Asia like India, even though their policies might be in place, still their implementation or kind of sustainability of the actions that are put in practice can be challenging. So what would be your views on this, how we can ensure that they are taken into account and put into practice?
So that really has to go back to the national transport policy. So actually looking at where women's needs are placed. So if they are placed with the vulnerable group, then you are actually just putting women needs with all the other needs, and then just it's all becomes mush because you're not able to figure out who needs what. And so I think that if we don't first acknowledge that women's needs are there, and if there are higher uses of public transport, then their needs actually need to be elevated to the point where design and implementation is along their transport needs.
Thank you. I think speaking of needs, maybe it's a good also transition to the next question, because needs is related to what extent do institutions have expertise, right, to bring in gender in the
Mm-hmm.
transport sector or transport institutions. And we see very often that this sector and institutions are male dominated and women have difficulty accessing as well as then
Yeah.
advancing in the career in the transport sector. So how we break that, and we know engineering, it's yes, we see maybe trend a little bit that more and more women are accessing the field, but still, if we
Mm,
look at also the global data and figures, particularly for Asia, and I think for South Asia, the figures are especially low. So do we break and how we support bringing in more expertise in the field and
mm.
industry, gender
That is a
expertise?
very good question. I don't think there's a clear answer to that. I mean, there's quite a few things that you need to do. First of all, I think it's a systematic change. So it's first the acknowledgement that there is a need. And I think often when you are trying to make a change to a system that has been grounded in societal norms that has been around for centuries, then I think that it is re-educating. So I think it's sending the message, it's re-educating, it is support from international organizations such as the ADB to drive these messages that this is now the new system, this is how we're going to design, and making gender basically a priority. Because if we, just like we've made climate adaptation and climate change a priority, and it has been picked up even in the most unresourceful countries, they have decided some way of figuring out how to do it, because it is a measure that has been set by a standard that has been set by international organizations. Similarly, I think that if we do the same, if we make this something that is pushed and not just a mini women's club, and like only women care about this issue, if we can start getting everyone on board, and slowly over time the system will change.
Yes, and I think we need to also create more networks among those few women who are already in the sector, and
Yes,
so they are
that's right.
more visible, and they are give example to especially to younger generation. Particularly this sector is one of the high paid sector, and this is often because of the, you rightly mentioned, the social norms. We see
Mm.
that women don't tend to enter and that of course impacts the how the
the
transport
For the
is being
decisions that
planned.
are made,
Yeah.
yes, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Ready for more questions? So,
Um, there was one question that was directly sent to me.
sure.
The question was, which city do you think is the poster child for good practice? That's a very difficult question to answer, but I will give my own personal opinion. I was in Singapore a couple of years ago, and I was sitting in the train, and I look up and I see this poster that they have, and they said, "We don't tolerate harassment." So if you are caught, if you are reported, then they had a fine, and the fine was pretty high. I can't remember the amount, but I remember raising my eyebrows, thinking that's a pretty hefty fine. And I think that when you and that I mean that alone, that messaging that there is a consequences for your action, I mean, it sounds simple, but it is effective, because it's saying that we're watching you, and if you are making an issue, it's actually giving the victims an empowerment to say that, okay, I am safe, I am in a safe space, and if something does happen, then there is a clear line of consequences of what could occur. And I think that's a very small example of a very simple example of how some small things can actually make big impacts.
Yes, indeed. Thanks for sharing. Um, and there is one more question about going back to safety,
Mm,
of course, and in the context of road infrastructure and transportation services, how can local safety interventions, for instance, local government, be strategically leveraged to mitigate risks and proactively prevent incidents of SEA, particularly when it concerns rural population
mm,
or vulnerable groups,
mm,
not only women, but also persons with disabilities or younger
mhm,
people or children.
mm.
So,
Yeah, how can we actually? I think it's the reporting mechanism. That is the starting point for a victim. So Of course, the messaging needs to be there, that it's clear that, you know, if something was to occur, then there are consequences. Empowering the victim. Then if you have a very clear line of how this reporting actually works and it's communicated directly to the victim, then it becomes very easy for the victim to understand, you know, if I report this and it's actually going to go somewhere. And I think that's really something that local authorities can do better, because this is an underreporting is an issue both in developed, and even so it's a major issue in developing countries. So I think allocating some resources to how we can actually report incidents and then carry them out is really important, because it also empowers the local authority too. They then have statistics and data to then figure out, understand where the breakdown points are in the system, where the issues are. Even just looking through the type of harassment that are happening. Is it due to visibility? Is it due to lack of natural surveillance? Is it a particular area in the town? So then you can actually direct different security resources to different portions of the network to suit where the issue is.
Thank you. So there was a question, which city is the poster child for good practice from?
Yeah. So that was
Yeah.
my answer to Singapore.
Yes, yeah, Singapore, yes.
Yeah.
And yes, I think if there are more questions, let me check. Yes, there is one more. Um, yes, so there is a question about that brings in the lens of not only women, but a bit intersectionality and speaking, for instance, of the persons with disability. And the question is on the importance of collecting data. But I think I also had this question because we know data is important, but um, even ADB, I know how we sometimes have a lot of gaps when it comes to transport. It doesn't matter, is it urban transport or roads? That main focus is on, yes, on studies, but real beneficiaries who are behind as users, maybe sometimes not adequately researched. And yeah, so that's what we face. So what is some of the effective, I don't know, approach in that? What kind of data need governments to keep, or where can development partners like ADB and others can step in? And we know, for instance, when there is, say, sexual exploitation, abuse, or harassment, frequently is not reported.
Yes.
And there are sometimes community-based organizations or civil society who keep mostly qualitative data. So that makes a little bit difficult to have the evidence. And especially, you know, when there are social norms, women also don't tend to speak on those issues. So what is it that we can do to generate more evidence that can help us then advocate for not only women, but also other groups, other vulnerable groups?
Yeah. So I spoke about underreporting, and I won't say that again. So underreporting and making a systematic change to how incidents are reported, and making sure that it's anonymous, so the victim is not then identified later on and harassed and already in a victimized state. I think that's really important. The other thing is, oftentimes when we go to actually collect data, we almost as transport agencies assume a level of literacy. So we collect data in some sort of form, like online survey, paper survey, or we do something. And the marginalized community are often those who have low literacy too. So they actually get, they're pulled out of that voice. So their voices remain unheard. So what can organizations like ADB, and I think it's just first of all realizing that we need more data in this. So it's almost allocating resources and understanding that when we are, it's understanding the boundaries of what data we are collecting. So if we first understand what are the boundaries of the data we're collecting, then we know that what scope and what we're not collecting. Then maybe we can allocate resources, some to the boundaries of that data for that literacy assumption, And then maybe we can allocate some resources for low literacy. And that could be, for example, in forms of community-based conversation. It could be in-house interviews. We really have to meet the user where they are. So that does require making sure you pick someone who is of the community, who know, and then also to ensure that the participants are also protected, because that's the other issue with a lot of culturally sensitive countries, is that you don't want to put in information and then next thing you know, what you've said is out in public, and that's probably the worst thing that could happen. So there's no privacy for the participants. So I think ensuring that there's privacy, how we collect data, in what form, and understanding really the boundaries of what kind of data we're collecting. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. Yes, exactly. I think it's quite broad topic, and we can discuss a lot about
Yes.
data. But really, for us, it's really a starting point, because when we can show that there are gaps, then no, that is usually basis for us to come up with gender inclusive measures in our projects, because just judging from our desks, of course, no, cannot benefit everyone and all the groups who will be then using that transport. Let's check one more time. And yeah, I think there are a couple of more questions. Maybe we take some of that. So the question is, yeah, there are some innovative approaches when it comes to harassment, tackling with harassment. So how do you think there is readiness or openness to adopt that when it comes to addressing harassment in public sector? I think that would be the last question to take on. Thank you.
Sorry, I think the internet froze there. I didn't catch the full question. Do you mind repeating?
Yeah, there are many innovative and models and good practices from various countries that are addressing harassment in public transport. So, do you think that there is readiness to be adapted those in some of the contexts, particularly, in some of the South Asia or Southeast Asia countries, for instance, or any other? What are your views? To what extent we need innovation on that? Maybe that's a
Oh,
broader
right. Okay.
question.
I am aware that there's a lot of crowdsourcing applications. For example, Safety Pin was one where women actually were able to put in locations for where they felt unsafe. But what happens is that it could be there's a benefit and a disbenefit. The benefit is that you are crowdsourcing the information and figuring out spatially where the issues are. The disbenefit is that you are entirely relying on perception, and there is no way of evaluating exactly what's happening. So, someone could feel very unsafe at a certain time, and they could rate this as very unsafe, and then someone else could come in and say, actually, it's really safe. So which one do you believe? So I think it's like with any data, there's cleaning up of data, there's looking at good data and figuring out what actually works. But I think we are in the infancy stage of adopting technology to figure out how we can reduce harassment. I think it really comes down to figuring out what are it's individual. Each country has its own context, and each country has its own makeup of societal fabric. So I think first it's really to figure out what that causes, and then to figure out what kind of innovative, such as apps or any other sort of way of data collection methods can be useful. I know, like for example, in some countries you may not actually have a personal device to actually put in information. So again, you are cutting out people who actually have a device and those who don't. So again, it comes down to that restriction.
Thank you very much. I think we are just right on time, and big thank you, Subeh, and thank you to all the participants for your questions. And I'm sure there are a lot of insights and takeaways from this session. that we can further carry on with regard to our work, and look forward to see you in the consequent webinars of ADB on transport. So thank you very much to the ADB transport sector, and Subeh, thank you very much for your
Thank you,
insight.
Kita, and thank you for all the participants for your questions. Excellent questions. Okay.
Indeed.
Have a good day,
Thank you.
everyone. Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Have a nice day. We are closing the webinar. And thank you again.